I've ordered every federal agency to eliminate rules that don't make sense.
It's the usual French talk, stall and surrender.
All scientists, dinosaurs, are kryptonite. The cultural soul of the narrative.
You Americans have given us surrender. Sense grows very evil.
Make our planet great again.
All right, so welcome back for another episode of the Royal Palace Podcast. I'm here with Liam, and we're going to be talking about Telegram. This comes after Telegram's CEO was arrested in France in the framework of what we would call an information judiciaire, which we'll get into what that means in a bit here. But the reason I wanted for us to cover this, even if we're a bit late to the party, is because I feel like by listening to other podcasts and seeing what's being said about this issue in the media, there is an utter lack of a more European perspective as to what is going on here. And there's almost an unwillingness, or at the very least an ignorance, of the context that is France and France's legal system. So with that said, let's sort of roll it back and talk about, well, what is Telegram in the first place? Because that is going to have a significant impact for what happens after. So Telegram is a popular messaging app that has features that go beyond what you would consider like a classic messaging app like, Signal, iMessage, or WhatsApp, because they have features that kind of resemble that more of like online forums.
It has these channels, right? That's a big feature where sort of a famous person, a politician or a celebrity can communicate stuff in a chat with their followers.
They're essentially like massive group chats, but it sort of operates in a way I would say, there's not exactly an equivalent, but it kind of feels a little bit like using Twitter. It also feels a little bit like using Twitter because of the lack of content moderation, right? That is actually what allows Telegram to be a popular app for illegal stuff that I'm sure we've all heard about already, but also for war material, right? Telegram is used by both sides in the war that's happening in Ukraine right now, right? Russians are spreading their information on there, as are Ukrainians. And it's because when you publish this stuff on Facebook, Facebook doesn't like necessarily some of the violent content that people post.
Most social media like Facebook has even automated content moderation that will detect if a video appears to be showing war imagery and delete it immediately without even someone having to report it, right?
That is my understanding of it. It's always kind of hard to understand because a lot of these companies operate like black boxes. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that if you're looking for real-time war content, Telegram is a great option, regardless of which side you're looking for.
Yeah, and it's also very popular on both the Russian-Ukrainian side because Telegram, unlike almost any of the other major social media platforms besides TikTok, isn't an American company. It has its origins in Russia.
So that brings us to its CEO,
Pavel Durov. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly. I've only been learning Russian for a year. Pavel Durov is an interesting character. He's from Russia, and he made his fortune founding Vkontakte, or as it's now called, VK, which is, I believe, the main social media in Russia. It's kind of, I've never used it. From what I understand, it's very much like Facebook.
And like Facebook, my understanding is only old people use it these days.
He's the Mark Zuckerberg of Russia. And he founded VK with his brother Nikolai.
Why was Vkontakte so popular in Russia?
Vkontakte. Work on your Russian. I'm not sure. What I do know is that Russia seems to mostly, even before they started getting sanctioned a couple of years ago by all the American tech companies, even before that, Russia has long had its own very strong tech sector. And nobody uses Google there. There's a Russian search engine that I'm blanking on the name of.
Yandex,
that's it. And they generally just have Russian versions of almost everything. And that's definitely hugely accelerated since the sanctions started, meaning that people can't access most of the American websites there since 2022. But Pavel Durov left VK long before that happened. He left VK in 2014.
Because the Russian government basically forced the sale of Vkontakte, and that's how he became a billionaire, especially because he cashed out before the ruble collapsed in 2014.
But it also means that although you may be hearing in the media that this has a lot to do with him being Russian and with Telegram being founded in Russia, which is true. He very much is not someone who's close to Putin, and he's had a pretty rocky relationship with the Russian government, and he left Russia completely. And he says he has no intention of going back in 2014, soon after he founded Telegram. And he then has been stacking up citizenships in especially a classic Russian billionaire way. He acquired the citizenship of St. Kitts and Nevis in 2013, and then of both France and of the United Arab Emirates in 2021. And he's based out of Dubai, and Telegram has its headquarters in Dubai. But it's interesting he has French citizenship. Some countries have a purely you spend this amount of money and you will get citizenship. That's exactly what St. Kitts and Nevis has. You can buy St. Kitts and Nevis citizenship, which, if people don't know, is a tiny island in the Caribbean. And it's a pretty good source of money for them. They sell their citizenship for $250,000. Of course, it's not a very useful citizenship compared to French citizenship. France doesn't do that. They don't have that's looked down upon in the EU. The EU pretty much bullied Cyprus to stop doing that because, again, a lot of Russians were taking advantage of that. So France is too respectable to sell their citizenship that explicitly. Instead, what they do is that there's an article in the Civil Code that allows the government to give French citizenship to people, completely putting aside the normal residency requirements and so on, because they have contributed a lot to either French culture or to France's economic standing in the world. And when Macron came in, Macron's a big tech guy, and one of his biggest things has been trying to make Paris and France in general the Silicon Valley of Europe. That would definitely be a good subject for a future episode, is Macron's whole initiative of La French Tech. Yes, that's actually what it's called. They say it in English like that, La French Tech. And why it hasn't worked so well. But as part of this, he gave citizenship to Pavel Durov and also to several other tech billionaires, including Evan Spiegel, who's the American founder of Snapchat. And frankly, I find it much more respectable to just sell your citizenship. St. Kivas has got a sign out saying you can buy their citizenship. I think that's much more respectable than having it be all political and giving it to people that the president personally likes for whatever reason.
It does go to show, though, that I mean, look at the discourse around the recent sinking of boats in the Channel, right? This tech billionaire is able to accumulate 4 citizenships without much friction, and these people, these people can't even get a basic residency.
And do you think that that's embarrassing for the French government especially now that they're investigating Pavel Durov and he's been arrested? Do you think that Macron is going, you know what, I may not do that again?
You know what is really weird? Him having citizenship has saved him in my mind.
Yeah.
Because I have heard so many people talk about this case and say, I don't understand. How can France have jurisdiction over a company that's based in Dubai? How do they have any jurisdiction over this tech billionaire? And then they say, oh, he has French citizenship. Therefore, there's jurisdiction. Okay. People are like, now I understand. Now it's fine. That is not true. They could pursue him for the same possible charges that they are pursuing him for today, regardless of his citizenship. We'll get into that in a little bit. But I just want to say that, ironically, the story here, at least the one that the media is running with, is not, why did you give this guy citizenship? What in God's name is he contributing to the France? Especially if you believe that Telegram is involved in crimes.
Yeah, but it still seems like it would be a bit embarrassing for Macron. And yet, here's a direct quote I found from Macron, since Durov was arrested. He says about this, "It was taken in the context of concerted strategy. It is a very good thing, and I will continue to do it." About giving citizenship to random tech billionaires. So
awesome.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
All right, Telegram. I want to look at it from a more technical perspective. So Telegram is an application that, if you read their description on the Play Store or the iOS Store, or even on their own website, is a messaging first app. It's like iMessage, it's like Signal, it's like WhatsApp. I don't totally think that's an accurate portrayal of what it is, because I think if you look in practice, anybody who's used Telegram knows that the value added of Telegram is its channels, right? It's more social media platform-esque aspect of the application. That's why it's used in the Ukrainian theater, because you can share among, groups of thousands of people content. And, that's a big difference, because I think WhatsApp has like a maximum number of participants in their group of around 1,000. The reason for that, which we'll get into in a minute here, is because doing end-to-end encryption with large groups of people is really difficult.
If you've never heard of this and wonder who the hell is doing that, the answer is a lot of people. It's especially really popular in the whole Russian-speaking world and in Ukraine. It's like you've got generals, politicians, everyone doing this in that world. Doesn't seem to have really caught on in the US in the same way.
Yeah, and so Telegram is, I think above all, it's a social media platform as opposed to a messaging first app. But that's just my personal opinion. It also is unique in that it has unlimited upload limits for file sizes, which is, just remarkable, right? Like, how much does Google Drive charge you for a terabyte of storage a month, right? Telegram, I could upload 100 terabytes to their server, and they'll host it for me for free. We should store our audio from the podcast there.
How do you think they're affording all of that? That seems crazy.
I have no idea. Supposedly they run ads. But who does that? Who just allows you to upload all that content? I don't know. But what I do know is I think that you have to take that into account when you ask whether or not it's a messaging first app. Because, again, WhatsApp's not probably happy with you uploading several terabytes to, between two participants in a chat, right? So as a result, Telegram is kind of almost like the new LimeWire. Like, you can find tons of pirated content on there. It's a common use of the app. Other crimes are involved too. I know a lot of people who are involved in like OSINT and tracking leaks, data leaks, often find that, massive data sets that are stolen from companies are posted on Telegram either first or after they have been purchased on the darknet. So, as a result, it's a hub for certain activity. And the CEO of Telegram, as I'm sure most people know by now, has been hostile to the idea of moderation, or at least any sort of aggressive moderation. Now, my understanding is that Telegram has a remarkably small staff. So I think they have like 30 employees, something like that is what I heard.
Jeez.
All that is to say is, they are not doing the kind of moderation that Facebook or WhatsApp or Signal are doing. Now, as I said, I wanted to talk a little bit about the technical aspect because I felt like, a lot of reporting missed out on that. Because if you go to Telegram's description on the App Store, you'll see that they claim to be an encrypted messaging app. They even, they make claims that they're secure or whatever. You don't need to worry about law enforcement being able to access their content. In fact, on their website, they have an FAQ where they basically say that because they have shell companies all over the world, they don't use the word shell company, but that's my interpretation of it, to distribute their data centers, they can essentially slow down law enforcement's ability to access their content. This all sort of, I think, leads people to believe that Telegram is an encrypted messaging app in the same way that Signal or WhatsApp is. This is not true because WhatsApp and Signal rely on what's called end-to-end encryption. You know what end-to-end encryption is, Liam?
My very non-techie understanding is that end-to-end encryption means that the data is encrypted on your device before it is sent and is only decoded once it is received by the recipient device, meaning that the servers that are dealing with it, the company that handles it in between, has no possible way of reading it, right?
Yeah, that's right. Because importantly, the server side is not responsible for generating the private keys that are used on both clients. And as a result, it itself cannot decrypt the information. Now, this is an important part of Signal. It is what makes it so that when Signal gets a subpoena from law enforcement, they are unable to hand over the content of your messages. Of course, they have certain metadata that they're able to hand over, and they do because they're law-abiding.
And Telegram doesn't use this, you're saying?
No, so not by default. Telegram does have end-to-end encryption that you can enable in its settings. It's buried deep in there. You can enable it, but it's super primitive. It's primitive for a few reasons. First is it only works one-to-one chat. So Signal and WhatsApp have been attacking an immense engineering challenge that has allowed them to do group end-to-end encryption, which is very complicated and probably requires more employees than Telegram has to make work. Telegram doesn't do this. And yet, a big use of Telegram is these group communications. So they're not end-to-end encrypting those at all. But it's also primitive because it relies on both clients being online, meaning you literally can't send an end-to-end encrypted message if Liam's device is not actively connected to the internet at that given time. And they almost pretend like this is some sort of security advantage. No, it's not. Like the reason Signal and WhatsApp do it, they have a way to do it asynchronously such that we can essentially wait till Liam's client becomes online and he can then receive the message after it's already been sent. Furthermore, the actual protocol that they use is homegrown. So it's not based off of any standards like the Signal protocol is. It's not based on any best practices used by cryptologists. Instead, it's their homegrown solution that has been known to have pretty critical security vulnerabilities. And one of the biggest is that a lot of the parameters for the encryption protocol are determined server side, which is bad because if somebody gets control of the server, essentially they can tamper with the parameters that are sent to the clients and thus break encryption that way by doing man-in-the-middle attack. Now, that attack specifically is kind of theoretical in the sense that, I don't think this is happening, at least not on a large scale. There's not, no one has shown an example of this happening. But for example, if law enforcement were to do what they did with EncroChat, which was also an encrypted chat app, well, not an encrypted, but they claim to be an encrypted chat app. The French authorities broke in and were able to read everybody's messages and essentially do a man-in-the-middle attack where all new messages would just go directly to the French military police. So if they were to do that to Telegram, it would be quite vulnerable to that because it's relying on the encryption that Telegram is using is relying on the server being trustworthy. Now, that's not to say that Signal and WhatsApp don't have their own problems with trusting the server, right? You do need to trust the coordination server to some extent. But anyway, all that's to say, most chats on Telegram are just not being encrypted. And this is important for what's happening here. Telegram has access to the vast majority of messages and all the channels, which means that it can and probably should be doing content moderation, right? Because imagine if there was a Facebook group called Illegal Stuff Here, and all that was posted in there was illegal stuff. You can't be surprised that authorities might be upset that you're not doing anything about it.
So that's what Telegram is. Let's talk about what happened to Pavel Durov when he landed at Le Bourget Airport, an airport mostly used for private jet travel in the vicinity of Paris on the 24th of August.
So France had started an investigation involving Telegram. We don't actually have that many details about it because in France, this is supposed to be secret. And in the framework of that investigation, which is now importantly, and I think this is where Americans just start applying their own legal frameworks and understandings to what happened here in such a way that it just kind of leaves them confused and often upset. So when it comes to complex crimes, these are investigated by what we call an investigative judge. So this is not a prosecutor. This is an investigative judge. It's a different thing. And this investigative judge basically orders the necessary steps in order to investigate whatever crime is alleged. But it would seem that there was some sort of child sexual abuse material, which you might notice that the French don't use that term. Instead, they still say, the French still say pedopornography instead of CSAM. But whatever the case may be, that led this investigative judge to investigate Telegram.
Let's pause for a minute and talk about what an investigative judge is, because that's a combination of words that sounds very strange to American ears.
So a typical prosecutor in France, and this breaks Americans' minds, is themselves a magistrate. In France, judges and prosecutors are not elected in any way. They are not appointed. There's no federal bench, as you will. Instead, they get their jobs by going to the National School of Magistracy, which is based in Bordeaux. So it's basically a competitive examination process in order to go to this school. Then they go to this school for 3 years. And then at the end of 3 years, they become magistrates. Some of them become judges, like normal judges. Others become prosecutors.
So that means that judges and prosecutors are part of the same system in France, which is a big violation of this American ideal of the judiciary and the administration or the executive being completely separate.
So what's important there is most of these people were not, have not, and will never be lawyers. It's not like the US where everyone's first a lawyer and then, we divide you out between being a judge, defense, and prosecution. No, these are sort of public servants who wear very cool robes.
They wear great robes. Very cool. I kind of want to be one.
And what this means is that both judges and prosecutors are very well trained on the law, right? They get a specialized education. They are sort of the crème de la crème in the sense that they go through a competitive selection process, right? That's basically objective. I'm not saying there's not social inequities that exist there, but I mean, it's objective in the sense that it's not because you know someone that you can become a judge or a prosecutor. It's because you succeeded at this very competitive examination process and you got in. Of course, once you're in the judiciary, once you are a prosecutor, once you are a judge, internal politics can determine how you advance in your career.
And they're also not really political positions in the way they are in the US.
Oh, of course not. No.
Where like Kamala Harris, who, like the prosecutorial roles in the US can end up just being sort of political stepping stones in the same way other state offices are.
It is so important to understand that in France, and we'll talk about this more on later episodes, but in France, judicial professions, like writ large, are much less political than they are in the United States. Now, lawyers, for example, they can't have other jobs. If you're a lawyer, that's your job. You cannot also be like the biggest real estate developer in your local town, which is something you see a lot, right? You see like lawyers in the US, not only can they commercialize their practice, right? They can run annoying ads on TV and on bus stops or whatever. They can, you often see this in the US where lawyers are basically promising to win their cases, through advertising or whatever. But then they also in parallel have just like their own businesses and whatever. You don't see any of that in France. Why? Because it's not allowed. It is against the rules set by the professional orders, which themselves are kind of a part of the administration.
So then how is an investigative judge different from a prosecutor if prosecutors are all magistrates anyway?
Right. So prosecutors work directly with police and sort of manage many investigations, right? I mean, the job with the prosecutor, first of all, France doesn't have the plea deal system that they have in the United States. I mean, plea deals have an increasingly large place in the French judicial system, but it's actually for like minor offenses. But generally, plea deals they don't occupy the kind of place that you have in the United States. I mean, I think it's like 90% of cases are and then plea deals, something crazy like that.
Something crazy, yeah.
Yeah, so you can imagine that in a context in which, as all administration is in the world, I mean, the administration of justice is generally poorly funded, that means that, prosecutors are juggling dozens of cases a day, probably, maybe even more than that. So they don't really have the time to investigate something that requires, several months of inquiry. And, the people under them don't necessarily have the time either. Because basically, what's interesting about the prosecutor in France is that they are the person who validate sort of judicial measures of investigation. So imagine you want to execute a search warrant. In the United States, the prosecutor brings their warrant or their request for a warrant before a judge. In France, it's the prosecutor themselves who approves the request of a judicial police officer, a search, for example. And so there are literally, they call it, I think they call it procureur de permanence, who's just like in front of a phone getting calls from judicial police officers where they say, hey, look, this is what happened. Can we search his car? I already hear people in our non-existent comments saying that they're concerned about, well, how can the prosecutor just approve these things? Isn't it in his interest to, or in their interest to always approve a search warrant? Yeah, I mean, sure, but I think that applies generally to how it works in the US as well. I mean, like most of the time, judges just rubber stamp it. But I think an important thing is, at least in the I don't know what the statistics would be on this. I don't know if we can say definitively, but I think in the culture of this, prosecutors are supposed to be exercising their powers in the name of the people. They're not supposed to just be winning cases because that's the state's job, but rather they're supposed to be considering the rights of the people they might be violating when they execute it, or when they order a search warrant. Look, I'm not saying that's what's happening, but I'm just saying that I think there's definitely a cultural barrier there where maybe the idea maybe there's not a huge difference in practice between how it works in the U.S. and how it works in France, at least in terms of whether or not prosecutors are going to be a little overzealous in authorizing judicial measures of investigation. Whatever the case may be, when it comes to an investigative judge, their job is to essentially prepare an investigation, but they are not the ones who try it. So they will order measures, like they'll essentially tell the police to search someone's house, search someone's computer, do whatever they need to do. They'll interview people, right? They'll say, hey, we need this guy for an interview. That's what happened with Telegram CEO here. They needed to interview him in the framework of their investigation. Now, it wasn't immediately clear at the beginning, despite what the press immediately ran to, that they were investigating him, right? They might have just wanted to arrest him for questioning in order to hear his side of the story for something else in which the main suspect is someone at Telegram, right? So it wasn't necessarily him, the subject of the investigation. Obviously, now it seems like that is the case, that he is at least seemingly going to be the person held responsible for some of the things with Telegram. Yeah, all this to say is an investigative judge is in this case just playing the role of prosecutor, but they just prepare this case. This will actually be handed over to a prosecutor to try eventually, if there's sufficient evidence. Like, the investigative judge will not be the person who decides whether or not he's guilty or not.
So what are Pavel and Telegram suspected of, potentially?
There's complicity, right, in all of the things we've already alluded to. There's complicity in, the essentially due to a lack of moderation. And I want to talk about that real quick. This is where I start pulling my hair out, because Americans say, well, you can't hold platforms liable for what their users say on them. And I'm like, why? Like, what makes you think that? And they say, because we have the Bill of Rights and we have case law that says you can't hold people responsible for the actions of their users on platforms. Let's take these one by one. So on the Bill of Rights question, right, people are saying, there's the First Amendment. No, there's not. Okay, the First Amendment does not exist outside of the United States. That doesn't mean they don't have freedom of speech. That doesn't mean they have legal frameworks that make it such that you have a right to say certain things. But there's no First Amendment, so stop bringing it up when it comes to Telegram. I mean, it's just absurd, right? Like,
yeah, that one doesn't require to be addressed that much, because there's nothing to do with America in this case, at least not directly. It's a non-American citizen, a company based in Dubai, and French territory.
Yeah, it's so absurd, but you hear people bring this up. And again, it doesn't mean that there's not, I mean, who knows, right? There's different rankings, but some say that in terms of like freedom of the press, freedom of expression, France is better than the United States. Now, we'll tackle that specific question on another episode, but like, it is not because there is no First Amendment as such in France that what is happening here is a violation of any sort of notion of freedom of speech. But B, just like, what gives you the right to bring that up? I mean, you are in a different legal system. U.S. law does not apply. It's absurd to think it does. If you believe it does here, then what you're essentially saying is you do not recognize the sovereignty of other countries.
Which a lot of Americans do not.
Right, which is fine. If that's your position, say it, and we can move on. Okay, so the second issue is the case law. It is true that American case law has generally rejected the notion, on the basis of the First Amendment, that that platforms can be held responsible for the content of their users. Two reasons this is a problem. One, we don't have to apply U.S. law here, but the other reason is because this has been a big issue. So, Liam, do you remember Backpage by any chance?
No, what's that?
Backpage was a competitor to Craigslist, which was launched in 2004 and seized by the United States FBI on April 6th, 2018. This website was, as a competitor to Craigslist, at a disadvantage because Craigslist was obviously doing really well and honestly still is. I mean, just the fact that it's still around is a testament to Craigslist's success. But it turned out that all of their revenue was coming from their adult section because it was essentially free to post any other classifieds on Backpage, but you had to pay money in order to advertise in the adult section. Now, why would anyone pay for that when they could go to Craigslist? Well, because Craigslist realized very quickly and succumbed to law enforcement pressure to the fact that their adult classifieds were largely illegal because they were essentially for prostitution or for human trafficking. Now, Backpage essentially took advantage of the fact that Craigslist was backing out of the game and essentially profited off of the fact that they were able to advertise illegal content on there. You know, they were involved with several human trafficking cases, including that of child trafficking. So, the sexual exploitation of minors. Now, law enforcement had all the evidence in the world for this, believe it or not, but they couldn't get a conviction and they couldn't get Backpage to stop. They were so convinced that this was essential to their business model as it was that they refused to really take action. Now, they did start banning, based off dumb keywords, ads that people would post where it'd be like literally just saying black and white what the content was, leading advertisers to say, oh, well, we're offering young girls as opposed to saying under 18, right? Just things like that. Anyway, they were eventually stopped because the FBI was able to make a money laundering case against them. They were able to say that, well, look, they're money laundering proceeds from something that's illegal, which is human trafficking. But they couldn't actually get them for human trafficking itself because the case law that protects platforms from the content of their users essentially prevents them from being held liable for the fact that they were the one-stop shop for illegal sex services. You might say this is a freedom of speech thing, but I'm sorry, I think I don't share that same logic, and I think it's more than legitimate for a country to not, for a foreign country like France, to not subscribe to your logic of what freedom of speech means.
Yeah, and again, absolutely does not mean that there is a lack of freedom of speech in France.
So, what does this mean concretely in France? Well, France has a law. I'm not going to get into the details here because I just want people to get sort of the overview. France has a law by which platforms, so social media platforms, can be held for the content of their users if they don't do two things. What are these two things? First, they must put in place a mechanism by which users can report illegal content. Once you've done that, in order to escape liability, you must still do the second thing. The second thing is removing the content that is illegal, that is reported, and immediately transmitting it to the prosecutor for the Republic. What does this mean concretely? It means that if I'm on Telegram and I see some CSAM and I report it, it needs to be seen by a real person at Telegram who immediately removes it from the platform and who immediately forwards that content as well as any relevant metadata to the prosecutor for the Republic.
And this makes sense because we're talking here about illegal content. Now, you can have issues with what content is considered illegal, and you can say that France criminalizes too much speech. For example, Holocaust denial. You used to see on Twitter, back when Twitter had content moderation, I haven't seen it recently, you would see a tweet and it would say, this tweet cannot be shown if you're in your region due to local laws. If you're in France and Germany and you saw a tweet that had been caught by the content moderation as Holocaust denial, which is illegal in many countries in Europe, right? So you could disagree with that. You could say, I think it should be illegal to deny the Holocaust in France. However, that's a different question. And everyone kind of agrees that child pornography should be an illegal thing to post online. All these free speech hysterics, none of them would defend, say that you should be able to just freely post child pornography online, or if they do think that, they're too cowardly to say it in public. Right? So it makes sense that if some speech, quote unquote, is illegal, it should be required that a platform should take action against that illegal speech and allow it to be reported and send it to the judiciary.
It's really important to understand this is not law enforcement saying or creating the rules here. This is not the administration. This is the legislature, right? The representatives of the people who decide that something is illegal. I feel like that just sounds obvious, and everyone who's listening is like, well, of course it's a law, so it's passed. But like, who are you to say that the legislature doesn't have the right to ban something? I don't know. That's just kind of my reaction. It's just this idea that there's like something above. I look, constitutional law is above, law. It is above the legislate, like the acts, bills of parliament. At what point can the action of the legislature be restricted by some vague notion of freedom of speech? I just, it's kind of absurd.
In America all the time.
All of this is to say that in absence of moderation, you can be held criminally liable for the content itself, right? It's almost as if you did it, or at least you were complicit in it because you willfully disregarded the law. I already can hear a bunch of people screaming about compliance. Well, how are they supposed to comply with all the laws in the world? I don't know. How are you supposed to respect the speed limit when you drive to different countries? Like, big companies respect the law. Meta has implemented this in WhatsApp. Signal does this too. Most people do. I don't know. Like, just the idea that Telegram can get out of it because how are they supposed to know the law is kind of absurd.
I would also have more sympathy for that argument if this was like Wikipedia or a similar like user run nonprofit. But no, this is a for-profit company owned by a billionaire, and if they need to hire more people to obey the law in France, then they should either hire more people to obey the law in France or not operate in France. They're also allowed to do that. What you can't do is operate in a country and then not obey their laws. That is incredibly obvious with most things, right? If an American like supermarket chain opened up in France and started selling food that is legal in the US but is illegal in France because France has stricter consumer regulations on those things, everyone would be like, oh yeah, of course that's illegal, and French law would come down on them. But with internet platforms, people have some idea that these are like completely borderless things, which is just not true. I mean, same deal with Twitter in Brazil. If you followed that, I mean, I haven't followed that closely, but Elon Musk is currently feuding with a Brazilian Supreme Court judge because Brazil passed a law saying that all companies that are that operate in Brazil need to have a legal representative in Brazil, so that legal decisions can be communicated to them. Again, if it was any other company that wasn't a tech company, you'd be like, yeah, of course, how could they possibly be operating in a company without having a legal representative there? But for some reason, this really set Elon Musk off, and Twitter refused, and as a result, Twitter is now banned in Brazil, and everyone has just lost their minds about this. And I think even I'm seeing some like left-wing people be like, this is insane freedom of speech violation. It's like, well, again, this is how regulations on private companies work. If you're a multinational company and you don't obey the law in a country you operate in, of course they can say you can't operate here. Of course they can say that. I mean, obviously. My God.
This is why a judge in Spain took action against Telegram. This is why one would do it in Brazil. But also, here's the big irony in all this. All these companies are complying in other countries. Twitter, for example, they're complying in the EU. I don't know how well their mechanism works, but I know they have a mechanism at least to report content. It even snarkily says report EU content or something weird. Like, it literally says EU to make a point about it. Whatever.
Right, and they're doing it in such a way that makes it clear they don't want to be doing this, but they are legally required to, so they do.
Telegram complies.
For example, they definitely reached a deal with the Russian government. I'm not sure exactly what it was, to be allowed back into Russia, because from 2018 to 2020, Telegram was banned in Russia because they were doing too much free speech. Probably in that case, that is what was happening. And they reached some sort of deal in 2020, and they were let back in. So clearly they're willing to, like, when it's a really important market for them, they're willing to compromise on their dearly held values.
And so the other big thing that people have brought up in the press release that the Judicial Tribunal of Paris has brought forth regarding the potential charges against Telegram and its CEO is the importation of an encryption technology without prior declaration. A lot of people have translated this as prior authorization. That's not exactly what this is. It's actually It really is prior declaration. What that means is basically when you want to import for certain uses a form of encryption into France, you need to make a declaration to France's authority that is in charge of protecting digital systems, like informatics systems. And basically, this is a form. You provide some documents, you explain what your encryption is and how it works, but it's really not that exhaustive, and it's just a prior declaration. It's not like actually an authorization. So you just need to send in this form, sign it, and only if there's a problem, would that be an issue? But it's just a prior. Like, I can't express this enough. It's just like you don't have to wait for them to say, okay, we approve, if that makes sense. They just want to know you're using encryption.
I've seen a lot of people online basically saying that this law means that you have to turn over your encryption methods to the French authorities so that they are able to break your encryption for law enforcement purposes or whatever. Is that true?
That is not true.
So why is it they do that then?
I think there's a lot of reasons. And one of them is to ensure that the cryptology, like the technology that's being imported, can be tracked, meaning that they are aware it exists and that they can know it's where it's being used. Now, the reason they might want to do this is because they might want to know whether or not a actually reliable form of encryption is being imported and used in France. Might be concerned that Telegram is not using a secure enough form of cryptology, which, again, a lot of cryptologists say is in fact the case. But they also might be concerned, as has happened, that the US government is backdooring an encryption protocol. So it's really just an information collection game. I mean, they could have complied with this with a couple forms, a signature, and thrown it in the mail. That was all that was asked of them.
Do you think they just didn't know? They don't have enough staff to keep track of all the countries they need to be complying with?
I honestly don't know, because I think like Americans wouldn't even like bother, right? It would be like a willful ignorance on their part. They'd say, well, in America, I don't need an import license. Therefore, I don't need one elsewhere, right? I feel like, especially people's outrage about this, like no one, I mean, like my respect to 404 Media and their reporting on this topic, it's been overall great, like don't get me wrong, but they nonetheless published a story in which they talk about, oh, this may be a concern, but we don't know enough about it, which is fair. But a lot of people don't even admit that they don't know enough about how this works, right? They don't even bother contacting the French authorities to understand how this works. And look, I'm not an expert myself. I don't know what's going on behind closed doors. I don't know how these administrative authorities are really dealing with this. But again, the accusation here is that they haven't done the prior declaration. Okay, they haven't done the prior declaration and then had the authority say, hey, we don't like this encryption protocol you're using. They just haven't filled the form and mailed it. And it's just not, in my mind, it's not a concern. Now, I'd point out that the U.S. has export restrictions on encryption methods. And I don't hear any outrage about that. Now, people say, well, it's different because, importing prevents you actually using it, whereas exporting just means you can't send it to our adversaries. Yeah, but why do you think there's an export license required in order to export encryption methods from the United States? Well, it's one, because they don't want adversaries to have good encryption, but it's also because maybe they want to have a control in the way in which it's exported, as we have seen in the past. By the way, there's a lot of things in France that require prior declaration. For example, if you want to say add a room onto your house below 25 square meters, you need a prior declaration. It's a normal thing. I don't, people just get mad about things they don't understand. And it's understandable because the media doesn't even try to explain or understand.
So there's one more commentary I've heard on this from a lot of sources that I take much more seriously than the other ones we've talked about. That may just be because I'm tech illiterate. And less legal literate than you. But a lot of people have been saying that this has something to do with the fact that Telegram, again, as I said before, is one of the only major tech companies or social media platforms that isn't American and isn't based in America and is completely out from under the aegis of the power that the U.S. government has over companies that are based in the U.S. And worse than that, it is a company that started as a Russian company and that is led by a Russian citizen. And again, he has an ambiguous relationship with the Russian government, but they aren't entirely hostile to him. In fact, the Russian government has gotten very upset at France diplomatically over his arrest. So some people have been saying this has something to do with the U.S. just being unable to accept that there are tech platforms that are outside of its, of the aegis of the greater American empire. You saw a similar thing with the attempted TikTok ban. And so that's that idea that France, a close American ally, especially under the current government, is coming after Telegram because of their closeness with Russia and because they are outside of the immediate reach of American intelligence and law enforcement, is for me something where I'm like, from everything you say, it doesn't seem true, but it's the kind of thing that sounds like it could be true to me.
I think it's plausible that the actual circumstances which would eventually create a climate or maybe even lead to some decisions to move against Telegram would be in a global geopolitical context in which there is a conflict, a nascent conflict between sort of U.S. hegemony and movements in Russia and China. I do think we can apply a new Cold War lens to what is happening here. However, people will say, okay, well, there's this conflict going on. France felt there was essentially enough political acceptance, or maybe it may have been a political ask of the United States to go after Telegram. I have no idea. But that does not therefore mean that Signal and WhatsApp are backdoored and the US is just trying to shut down the one non-backdoored app. Now, I know you didn't say that, but that's certainly kind of the vibe I get of people who bring up this argument online. With that said, I mean, yeah, there's a bigger macro geopolitical thing going on here that I think is undeniable.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even necessarily say it has to be something like a backdoor. I think it's also just the case that, if you take something interesting that Yanis Varoufakis said in his latest book, is that a big part of the new Cold War between the US and China is a fight over domination of the tech realm, that China is the only country that can really challenge the US for that. And I definitely think with TikTok, I mean, it's hard to say that obviously the TikTok ban thing is 100% political and there was no legitimate concern there. It's quite a different situation. But I do still kind of feel that irrespective of what a given company like Telegram is doing, its very existence as a non-American major tech platform is kind of threatening to the US.
As I said, I think there's a grain of truth here, but this discussion belongs in a discussion of the new Cold War and not in the discussion of Telegram. So I just want to say about the encryption aspect of this is that, like, without end-to-end encryption, as we have already explained, is just not default and is not standard, and it is not the majority of messages that are being sent on Telegram. And even if it is, again, it's a questionable encryption protocol that they're using and that they built themselves. So this means that they can likely, because they control the server, they can read your messages. And at least they have the technical ability to, if they want to. They can share them with the Russian government. They can share them with law enforcement if they wanted to. They can share it with, say the government in which they are so graciously operating in, which has been historically hostile to encrypted chat apps.
I have all the faith in the world in the Emirati government, and I'd be very happy to send them all my messages.
It is at least my understanding. I want to be wary about commenting on foreign laws I don't understand, but it is my understanding, at least, that encrypted chat apps are generally not tolerated by the government there. Okay, so why would you trust Telegram? I mean, I just don't think there's a good argument. There's not a technical argument for it, and there's not a political one for it.
However, would you agree that it is very hard to picture this happening to any of the big American tech CEOs in a European country? Or imagine the outcry even if Elon Musk got arrested passing through Brazil.
To be fair, Elon Musk probably should be arrested if he comes to Europe, because some of the shit he says is defamation, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, I mean, so look at the things he's been tweeting about France and Brazil recently. He should absolutely be dragged to court in both countries. But also, like, Twitter's content moderation is now definitely allowing illegal content in Europe purely because Elon laid off like the majority of Twitter's workforce, including like almost all of the content moderation team. But it's still like, it's very hard to imagine that if he landed in any European country and there was a judge who wanted to put out an arrest warrant for him, that someone political wouldn't step in to stop that from happening.
Well, let's not jinx it.
Yeah, let's not jinx it. I would love that to happen. Obviously, that would be amazing. Elon, please fly to Brazil right now.
My personal opinion is any tech billionaire who is not respecting France's laws on speech or on platform moderation deserves anything that is coming to them by legal means. And I think it is too early to say whether or not Elon Musk today can come to France.
I agree. It's like the fact that I don't think this would happen to an American tech CEO doesn't mean I don't think it should happen to a Russian one. I think if this is a double standard, then this is the standard that should be generally applied. You know, I don't.
Absolutely.
I'm also I'm not sympathetic to billionaires, and I'm also not sympathetic to libertarians. And it's a bit weird to see a number of left-wing people show sympathy for this person who is both of those things.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il faut que la France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.